You've heard of the hero's journey, the Save the Cat beat sheet, and then Harmon's story circle. You've probably used them to follow their beats, hit every mark, and yet something still feels off. Or worse, your story didn't fit into those boxes, and people told you that it's your fault. They said your structure was weak, that you were missing the midpoint, the third plot point, or some other beat they insist every story needs. But here's the truth. These popular frameworks, they're not about story structure at all. They don't deal with the core components of a story. They deal with the order in which you present them. They are actually storytelling structures. And if you confuse story structure with storytelling structure, you will keep creating uninspired narratives that seem to check all the boxes but still lack any emotional depth or true meaning. In this video, I will explain to you what true story structure is and how, at the heart of every story, lies a conflict of beliefs, not a series of beats. There are two different aspects of story structure. The structure of experiences the characters and audience goes through, that is, the storytelling structure, and the structure which gives meaning to those experiences and makes a story recognizable as a story. The second one is the foundation of all stories, yet it is the first one, the storytelling structure, that most writers focus on and erroneously believe true story structure to be. But they make one crucial mistake. They believe because there is an effective way to order the experiences the character and the audience goes through, that this is how stories actually work. This is the core issue of the Save the Cat beat sheet, the hero's journey, and then Harmon's story circle. They define a certain way a story can be told, not a universal pattern underlying all stories. The story beats deal with the emotional experiences the characters undergo on their journey, but these can differ from story to story. The true building blocks of story structure are beliefs. Beliefs give meaning and structure to our experiences. Experiences are meaningless on their own. They need to be interpreted through the lens of a belief to gain significance for our lives. But if beliefs structure how we perceive, interact with, and experience the world, then a character's experiences do not lie at the heart of the story. Beliefs do. Storytelling structure describes the most effective sequence of events and experiences which the characters and the audience can go through to reach a change of beliefs. In other words, it describes the process of personal transformation. The purpose of storytelling structure is to lay out the reasons in forms of emotions, actions, and choices as to why a character changes or sticks to their beliefs. It attempts to make sense of how a human being moves through different worldviews. For example, the all is lost and dark night of the soul moments are simply the most negative experience the character and the audience with them goes through. This kind of a negative experience is a powerful and most importantly understandable event which gives the audience a reason as to why a character changes their beliefs. Because their old belief led them to such a low point, it is understandable that they would have a shift in perception and want to change and accept a new belief. But notice, the change of beliefs is instantaneous and completely hidden from us. We don't actually see it, but we can understand it. The storyteller needs to order the character's experiences, in other words, arguments about what to believe in, into a sequence which makes personal transformation believable. The crucial reason why storytelling structure is not story structure is that it only cares about the temporal order of events. But true story structure cannot be temporal. Here is an analogy to make it clearer. True story structure is like a blueprint for a house. It has the whole house in mind. Every single wall, every single dimension. It is already complete. Storytelling structure, on the other hand, is like the process of building the house. The setting of the foundation, laying down the bricks, building the walls, the roof, and then designing the interior. First, the status quo, then the inciting incident, then the midpoint, and then the climax. They unfold one at a time, step by step. What binds the whole building process together, however, is the blueprint. Just on their own, the actions are disconnected and incoherent and would not lead to a solid building. Beliefs are this blueprint which guides the construction of experiences which will, at its completion, be recognizable as a story. Beliefs are what guides the story beats. The status quo, for example, is about the core belief the protagonist holds or which is pushed onto them. The inciting incident is the moment when two opposing beliefs finally come into contact. Otherwise, it is just a random event. Structural beats, or however you want to call them, are simply the different steps in the transformation of beliefs. The debate is when we first weigh the pros and cons of two opposing beliefs. The midpoint, when we finally see the truth in the new belief or the lie in our old belief. The climax is the final choice, which serves to confirm the shift in our belief or the clinging to the old one. But notice that each of these beats needs to refer to beliefs to even make sense in the first place. It needs a reference point, a lens through which it will gain meaning. And depending on how different beliefs relate to each other, we can get different story beats. That's why you can always find stories which don't follow the hero's journey or save the cat beat sheet. But there is no story which is not about beliefs. Beliefs structure a human life. What I believe about myself will create and structure the life I actually live. An opposing belief will then challenge how I currently live my life and show me a different way to live. This is what stories are actually about. They are an argument about how a life should be lived. And the two sides of the argument are two conflicting beliefs. True story structure is therefore more like a philosophical syllogism or a scientific experiment than it is like a template you need to fill. It is quite literally a proof. The proof unfolds in 3 acts. It sets up 2 contradictory hypotheses, gathers evidence for each one, and in the end concludes which one is true. All you need are therefore at least 2 beliefs, the argument between them, in other words, the conflict, and the conclusion of which one prevails. Here is a detailed breakdown. The first act shows the null hypothesis. It shows the dominant belief that structures the life of the protagonist or the life around them. However, a new belief comes crashing down into their life and it sets up a contradictory hypothesis. Maybe the way the protagonist was living until now is not true. Maybe the dominant belief they see all around them is not what they should actually accept. The second act is the process of gathering evidence for all of the hypotheses. Each event confirms the truth of either of the 2 opposing beliefs. The evidence piles up until it weighs in favor of only one of the beliefs. Finally, the third act is the final choice, which confirms the validity of one of these beliefs. One of the hypotheses prevails as true, and the protagonist chooses the hypothesis they believe best explains how life should be lived. Let's look at the example of the tree of life. It doesn't fit any storytelling structure, yet it has a crystal clear story structure. Act 1. The setup of hypotheses. We're introduced to young Jack and the O'Brien family in 1950s Texas. Within its first scenes, the film sets up the 2 hypotheses it will put to the test: the way of nature and the way of grace.
The nuns taught us there are 2 ways through life. The way of nature and the way of grace.
We are presented with the dominant belief, the way of nature, which is represented by Jack's strict and authoritarian father. We are also presented with the opposing belief, the way of grace, which is embodied by Jack's mother. By their very nature, these worldviews stand in conflict and enter an argument into which one best explains how the world works and how Jack should live his life. The second act, the experiment. The second act is the evidence gathering for which belief is actually true. Whichever belief can explain most of the experiences Jack goes through, it will confirm its hypotheses. Here, Jack lives in tension between these 2 models. His father teaches him discipline and control. His mother shows him tenderness and forgiveness. Moments throughout Jack's childhood serve as evidence for both beliefs. When his father's strictness becomes overbearing, Jack starts to resent him. When his mother shows him kindness, Jack feels at peace. But he also tests rebellion, cruelty, and dominance. Both beliefs have their pros and cons, and that's why it's so interesting to watch them in conflict. Act 3. the conclusion. The third act presents the conclusion of the experiment. As an adult, Jack is emotionally fractured and caught between these two beliefs. He even says these two beliefs will always wrestle inside him.
Father.
I never missed a day of work.
Mother.
I tithed every Sunday.
Always you wrestle inside me. Always you will.
However, he subconsciously accepted his father's belief and lived his life according to it. In the final scenes, we do get a sense he lets go and finally accepts grace over nature. But as Jack himself said, these two beliefs wrestle inside him, and they always will. That's what story structure is truly about. It is about the conflict of beliefs. Don't worry that your story doesn't have all the beats or doesn't fit a template. That's not what stories are really about. Explore how life should be lived and prove it to the world.